master of the macabre strikes again with a decidedly horrid tale of an unknown illness that sweeps through a cold, decaying mansion, and the madness that consumes the residents of this haunted vestige of the past. Is it the house? Or is it some sinister but familiar apparition that goes bump in the night? All will be foretold in this adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's classic, The Fall of the House of Usher.
During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hang oppressively low in the heavens, Jonathan Beringer is passing alone on horseback through a dreary tract of country. As the shades of evening draw on, he finds himself within view of the melancholy House of Usher. The building fills him with a sense of insufferable gloom. The bleak walls and vacant eye-like windows, the white trunks of decayed trees, turn his heart to ice.
Can this be the place? It is so sad, so depressing.
He guides his horse to the brink of the black and murky pond and gazes down at the inverted image of the mansion reflected on the water. He pulls a letter from his coat and reads again the cry for help that has brought him here.
Jonathan, it pains me to write after so many years, but I have no one else to turn to. I feel as if I am a prisoner in my own home.
A mist rises from the water, and with it, a sour odor of decay. Jonathan continues reading.
I have been confined to the house by an unknown illness that leaves me nervous and, I admit, moody. You are my only friend. Come quickly if you can. I would not ask it of you unless it was urgent. Roderick.
Roderick folds the letter and puts it in his pocket. The horse stamps. Uneasy, Jonathan runs his hand along the animal's sweating neck.
Easy, easy. I too would like to turn around and leave this place, but a friend needs my help.
Jonathan nudges his horse forward into a wooden bridge that is itself rotting. Reluctantly, horse and driver pass through the iron gate and enter the House of Usher. Up close, Jonathan sees that the exterior of the old mansion is covered with the peculiar growth of fungus. It hangs in tangled webs from the roof. Underneath the growth, a crack in the stone zigzags down the wall to the foundation of the house.
Welcome to the House of Usher, sir.
A groom steps forward from the shadows. Jonathan whirls around to face the old man.
I did not see you.
No, sir, but I saw you across the pond.
He points to the road Jonathan has just traveled. A gas, sluggish and glowing, rises from the water, sealing the House of Usher behind its lead-colored curtain.
Have you come up from Boston, then?
Why, yes. But how did you know? I did not write that I was coming.
Master has been expecting you. Not many people pass this way.
I don't wonder. It is so isolated. Tell me, are these waters healthy?
It is a dying lake, sir. Everything, even water, dies with time.
His words chill Jonathan. As the groom leads the horse away, Jonathan worries that perhaps his decision to come might have been made too hastily.
One evening. That's all I need to say. Perhaps tomorrow in the daylight, this place will seem less...
The front door opens. A thin, Pale old woman eyes Jonathan curiously.
You're the gentleman from Boston. Come in, come in. Master Usher is waiting.
But how did he know I had arrived?
He has his ways.
She takes Jonathan's cloak. Quickly, he glances into the parlor. Heavy tapestries, dusty and faded with age, cover the walls.
Follow me, sir. Master has asked for you every day for the past week.
Is he very ill? His letter said it was urgent, that I...
Sir, I wouldn't know now what he wrote to you.
She leads him up a staircase to the second floor. The flaming candles in sconces on the wall cast his shadow on the steps behind him, as if he were being followed. Upstairs in the hall, a door closes softly. A scowling, middle-aged woman mutters to herself as she sees Jonathan.
First I figured down to the bed and then Who are you? What are you doing here?
If you must know, I am a friend of the family.
A friend?
You seem surprised.
You are here for just a visit then? A short visit, I hope.
Who, may I ask, are you?
Lady Madeline's physician?
I thought Roderick, not his sister, was ill.
Ugh.
The doctor grunts and descends the stairs, her shadow fleeing before him. The old woman waits at the end of the hall. She whispers,
Be careful not to make any loud noises. That would only make things worse. You understand?
No, I do not understand. What is going on in this ghastly place?
She moves away without answering. The hem of her skirt drags along the floor. Jonathan takes a deep breath, then knocks softly.
Come in. Come in, Jonathan.
Roderick?
For a moment, he sees nothing but shadows in the dark room.
I knew you would come.
Jonathan turns to where the sound of the voice floats from a dark corner. In the faint light from the embers of the dying fire in the grate, Jonathan sees the form of his friend lying on a sofa. Heavy draperies cover the windows. Shelves of books line the walls. The air inside the room smells sour, not unlike the rotten swamp outside.
I cannot tell you how relieved I am that you have come. I heard your horse in the woods.
Across the lake in the woods? How could you possibly hear anything that far away through these thick stone walls?
If you only knew what I can hear. The sounds, they torment me.
Jonathan stares at him, stunned. Roderick's silken black hair is long and uncut and hangs about his face. A pallor has bleached his skin white like the tree stems outside.
Ah, you look at me with eyes of pity. I have changed, have I not?
What has happened to you? Your letter said you were ill with some unknown disease.
Sit down, and I'll explain, and I shall tell you what I can.
Perhaps I shall light a lamp first.
Jonathan leans toward the embers of the fireplace.
No! No light! Please, I cannot bear it.
All right, Roderick. Whatever you say.
I know not what the illness is, only that it has affected my nervous system. The faintest light tortures my eyes. The odors of flowers make my stomach churn. I can wear only soft-textured, loose-fitting clothing. Otherwise, my skin prickles as if stuck with 1,000 pins. And food, I can swallow only the most tasteless gruels.
Surely the doctors must...
Doctors must know nothing of what ails me.
Roderick stands and paces nervously.
They do not hear what I hear. The slight movements, the rustle of Miss Finley's skirt on the floorboards, the ripples across the pond when the wind blows, the scratching of rats inside these stone walls. They do not hear what I hear. They do not hear.
Roderick, how can I help you? What can I do?
He collapses on the sofa once more. For a long time he does not speak. Then he turns to Jonathan.
Do you know what I fear most? This house. I am its prisoner.
That's nonsense.
They shall perish inside this house, as did my father and grandfather before me. Look at me, Jonathan. Look at me, Jonathan. The noises, the odors, the lights have reduced me to a pitiful state.
Return with me to Boston. Surely there are doctors at the university who...
Roderick raises his hand, silencing him.
Listen. Do you hear it?
I don't hear you.
It is Madeline.
The door opens. A young woman steps inside. Jonathan rises. He has heard Roderick speak of his sister, but he has never seen her until now. Her silken black hair, white skin, and dark eyes are identical to Roderick's.
I had no idea you were twins.
Sister.
She walks across the room as if not seeing Jonathan or Roderick. She goes to a desk covered with books and papers. Roderick puts his arm around her.
You must return to your room. Come, we'll take you.
Her eyes stare vacantly past Jonathan. With a shock, he realizes she is asleep. At the door, Roderick looks over his shoulder.
Mrs. Finley will show you to your room. We will talk again in the morning.
Is there anything I can do?
You have come. But now, that is enough.
Jonathan steps from the house and breathes deeply the damp night air. He looks again at the wide crack in the foundation. He touches the mortar between the stones. It crumbles like salt on his fingers. Out from the shadows, where he has been waiting for his carriage, steps Dr. Caldwell.
If you have any sense, you will leave this place at once.
I've only just arrived.
Just the same, you can do nothing here. Leave this evil house while you're able.
Doctor, I'm not frightened of a house. People are evil, not mortar and stone.
How well do you know the House of Usher?
As I told you earlier, Roderick, I, and our friends, we met at the university 5 years ago.
Yes, but do you know him really?
He was quiet, kept to himself. I know the men in his family were famous artists. When his mother died, Roderick left school and returned here to care for his sister.
They are the sole heirs. There are no other surviving ushers.
What is wrong with Lady Madeline?
She suffers from catalepsy. It's a rare disease.
I've heard of it. The body becomes completely paralyzed.
Not quite. The body loses its will to move. The trance may last a minute, an hour, a day.
What causes it?
Agitation, nervousness. Some in my profession believe the disease is a form of, well, I shall say it plainly, Mental illness.
Is there no hope for her?
Her disease is baffling, but not fatal.
Hmm. And Roderick?
Him? He's a hypochondriac whose imagination wraps him in illness.
You mean nothing is...
Nothing is wrong with him physically, no, but up here, it's a different story.
The groom drives the horse and carriage to the front of the house. Before leaving, the doctor warns Jonathan.
I don't doubt you mean well by coming here, but you can do no good. Leave in the morning if you know what is good for you.
Will Mr. Roderick be coming downstairs to breakfast this morning?
Oh, no, sir. He always dines alone, what little he eats.
And Lady Madeline?
She is not well either. Poor thing.
Jonathan helps himself to sausage and a biscuit.
How long has Lady Madeline been walking in her sleep?
Since she was a child.
And her catalepsy? Has she suffered from that since childhood?
I dare not speak of it, sir. I cook the day's meals and mind my own business. At night, I go home to my cottage in the village.
I did not mean to pry. It's just that I tend to take Roderick and his sister from this house. In Boston University, doctors will examine them.
Leave here? The lady is dying. She cannot travel.
That is not what her physician says.
It is what Master Usher believes. Mark my words. When she dies, it will surely kill him.
Later that morning, Jonathan persuades Roderick to walk outside. The sunshine is weak and watery, but Jonathan insists fresh air will be beneficial to Roderick. The friends walk and talk about the family illness.
It runs in my family.
What is that?
This melancholy. Sometimes I fear losing my mind.
They stand on the bridge looking down at the rippled reflection of the house on the pond's black face.
You spend too much time in this mansion of gloom. Oh, forgive me. I didn't mean to be rude.
No, you are right. In fact, I have a theory about my illness and Madeline's, the illnesses of my ancestors. Of course, the doctors laugh.
Tell me.
It is the house. The fungus that clings to the stones, the mold in the air. It infects us. It is the source of our madness.
You and Madeline must return with me to Boston at once.
If only we could.
Tomorrow. I promise you, we shall leave here tomorrow.
The next morning, Jonathan dresses in his traveling clothes, anxious to be gone. When he opens the door, he finds Roderick trembling in the hall. His face is white with shock.
What is it? What has happened?
She's dead. My sister died in her sleep during the night.
Roderick languishes in grief on the worn sofa in his room.
I don't understand. Why you cannot wait one day? The doctor should examine the body before the burial.
What good did he do her in life? None. He will not touch her now. I forbid it.
But perhaps an autopsy would reveal...
No! We shall bury her ourselves in the family crypt. Tonight.
That evening, Jonathan helps Roderick carry the wooden coffin down the narrow steps to the cellar of the mansion. The dampness from the lake outside has caused mold to grow thickly over the crypt's stone shelves. The burial done, Jonathan returns to his room. Unable to sleep, he picks up a pen and writes in a notebook he brought with him.
How well I remember Miss Finley's word that Madeline's death would kill Roderick. I cannot leave him now in this grief-stricken state. Perhaps in a few more days I can persuade him to leave with me.
For several days, Jonathan tries desperately to cheer his friend, but Roderick refuses even to step outside. The only activity that soothes him is literature. For hours at a time, Jonathan reads aloud from the many books on the shelves. At night, alone in his own room, Jonathan feels a growing helplessness. He writes,
I can see now that I was wrong to think I could cheer his dark mind. Worse, I feel creeping upon me, by slow yet certain degrees, the wild influence of Roderick's fantastic superstitions about this house.
He sets down his pen. He stands, paces, then returns again to the desk.
If I do not leave soon, I'm afraid, too, I will become a prisoner of the House of Usher.
On the 8th day after the burial of Lady Madeline, Jonathan wakes suddenly during the night. He sits up gasping. Outside, a storm is approaching. He hears the tortured breath of the wind rising across the lakes. The tattered draperies rustle uneasily. The mourning, creaking sounds within the house fill him with alarm.
I must get out of here. Not tomorrow, tonight, now, at once.
He throws on his clothes and starts for the door. Just as he is about to undo the latch, a knock sounds.
Jonathan, I must speak with you.
Jonathan opens the door. A mad hilarity is in Roderick's eyes.
Have you not seen it?
He hurries past Jonathan and throws open a window. The fury of the entering dust nearly lifts him off his feet. The wild wind and racing clouds give the night a terrible beauty. A blood-red moon hangs low in the sky, now visible, now blotted by the knotted clouds.
You must see it. Look!
The vapors rising from the dying lake glow in an unnatural light.
Evil spirits enshroud the house. We are their prisoners.
It is only the gases rising from the lake.
Jonathan stares at Roderick. Grief for his dead twin has turned Roderick's skin to wax. He looks near death himself.
Something terrible has happened. Can you not feel it? Can you not hear it?
Quietly close the window. The air is chilling and dangerous.
Jonathan struggles to close the window against the wind as he leads Roderick to the chair near the door.
Do not leave me alone in this house.
Jonathan eyes the closed door. He could escape. He should. Leave while you are able, the doctor had warned him. Roderick is rocking in the chair as if in a trance. Jonathan squeezes his eyes closed, and then he turns to the table and an open book lying there.
I'll read to you. Together, we'll get through this terrible night.
His hands tremble as he turns the pages. The book's title is Mad Tryst, a story of a knight named Ethelred, who forces his way into the home of a hermit during, coincidentally, a terrible storm.
Feeling the rain Upon his shoulder, and fearing the rising of the tempest, Eldred uplifted his battle axe and
Outside, a crash of thunder shakes the very foundation of the House of Usher.
smashed the wooden plankings of the door. Then, with his gauntlet hand, he cracked and ripped away the wood. The noise and dry and hollow splintering echoed throughout the forest.
Jonathan stops reading. From a distant part of the mansion, he thinks he hears the very same sounds as described in the book. Wood, ripping, splitting.
Do you not hear it?
I heard something.
Oh, pity me.
It is only the wind. The good Eldred, now entering within the door, was amazed to discover a dragon with its fiery tongue standing guard before a treasure of gold and silver.
A muffled scream seems to echo somewhere in the dark. House of Usher.
Not hear it? Yes, I hear it. I have heard it. Yes, I hear it. I have heard it.
Jonathan, too, has heard the scream. But that is impossible. The servants have all left for the night. No one is in the house but he and Roderick.
On the wall there hung a shield of shining brass engraved with this motto: Who entereth herein, a conqueror hath been. Who slayeth the dragon, the shield he shall win.
I hear it. I have heard it many minutes, many hours, many days, weeks. I heard it.
And Eldred struck the head of the dragon, which fell before him, and gave up his pesty breath with a shriek so horrid and harsh and piercing.
Jonathan lowers the book. The sound is unmistakable now. A distant but harsh screaming comes from the chambers below. A woman's voice. Roderick rocks, his eyes fixed on the door. A sickly smile quivers about his lips. When Jonathan puts his hand upon his shoulder, Roderick shudders violently.
Said I not that my senses were acute? I tell you that I heard her first feeble movements in the hollow coffin.
What?
I heard them days ago, but I dared not speak. I dared not.
Roderick, what are you saying?
We have put her living into the tomb.
The Lady Madeline? But I saw her myself. She was dead.
And now tonight, Ethelred, the breaking of the door and the death cry of the dragon. No, it was her struggles to escape her tomb, her coffin lid. No, not the hermit's door breaking open.
Suddenly, a violent gust slams open the window.
Oh, where shall I fly? Will she not be here soon? Is she not hurrying to punish me for my haste?
Stop this insane talk. Madeline is dead.
Madman! You think I am a madman, but I can hear the heavy and horrible beating of her heart.
He springs to his feet.
I tell you that she now stands outside that door.
As if moved by the frantic energy of Roderick's voice, the heavy oak door swings slowly open.
She comes for me.
It is the wind. The storm.
Roderick's eyes are wide and terrified. He points. Lady Madeline stands in the doorway. Blood stains her white robe, the evidence of her bitter struggle to claw her way out of her tomb. As she reels upon the threshold, Roderick clutches his chest.
Madeline, sister, forgive me.
With a low, mourning cry, Madeline falls heavily inward upon her brother. As they both fall to the floor silent, Jonathan stares aghast. Neither Lady Madeline nor Roderick move. A violent bolt of lightning pierces the sky like a crooked finger. Jonathan flees down the dark hall and the shadowy stairs and out of the house and into the night. On the bridge he stops, panting. The house and its shadows are behind him. Suddenly, a wild light shoots from the sky and strikes the roof. The lightning zigzags down along the crack in the stones. Jonathan hears a long, frenzied shouting sound like the voice of 1,000 waters. It is the fierce breath of a whirlwind bursting from the clouds. As Jonathan watches in terror, the mansion walls explode, crashing down upon themselves. And then all is silent again. The deep and dank lake closes suddenly and silently over the fragments of the House of Usher.
You have just heard an adaptation of The Fall of the House of Usher, a classic work by Edgar Allan Poe, regarded as one of America's most influential writers and poets of the 19th century. Known for his tales of mystery and the macabre, he is heralded for being a leading figure of Romanticism in the United States and an early practitioner of the short story form. Joining us is Dr. Robert Vaughan, professor of English at Clayton State University. Welcome, Dr. Vaughan.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So when we listen to The Fall of the House of Usher, I think what many will pick up is that there's like this very foreboding and suspenseful tale of course, family, but there's also unknown illness and this haunted house. So tell our listeners a little bit about this particular story and Poe's inspirations for writing this story.
Well, it's really interesting. Of course, this is pretty much considered to be Poe's masterpiece, at least as far as his short fiction is concerned. And it seems to have had some historical roots. There was a house at the time outside Boston. It's actually a part of Boston now, and you can visit the site, but the Hezekiah Usher House. And the story went that the owner was an older man. He had a young wife who had an affair with a sailor, and he discovered this and in fact entombed them in the room where they had been meeting. And supposedly when the house was eventually torn down in 1830, there were bodies found embraced, in an embracing position in a cavity in the cellar. And so now I think that there may be a little bit of folklore that has gotten attached to that, but I do think there are some actual accurate historical roots to that story. Certainly Poe was familiar with it. And you can see we wouldn't just stop with the House of Usher if we started thinking about all of the dominoes that started kind of falling in Poe's imagination. We can trace them through many different things that he wrote, the premature burial, the cask of Amontillado, this whole idea of being buried prematurely, very big one in Poe. We may want to talk about that here in a few minutes. But so there was that route to the house. And I mean, I think that probably answers that aspect of your question, where the idea may have originally come from, what its roots were.
Right. And I would say, I think what's interesting to me is that one thing that stands out in this particular story is the personification of the house itself. You hear it right when the story begins, and just how Roderick comes to believe that this house has sinister manifestations. It feels like the house is almost leading to Roderick's madness. And so why do you believe that Poe used that literary device?
Well, I mean, there's kind of a couple of different answers to that. I mean, first of all, Poe we remember him really as kind of the father of the short story. He was a real innovator in that genre, and he wrote about the process of composing short fiction, and about how he believed building a particular effect in a story was really the most important aspect. That some particular chilling effect, and if we're talking about his tales of mystery, that he would try to develop that, and through the narration of the tale, cause it to build and to build. As far as it coming from the house, first of all, that becomes a trope that we have seen through the years over and over and over play out in popular media. Whether we're looking at something like, Shirley Jackson, of course, wrote The Haunting of Hill House many, many years later, I mean, a century after Poe, which is a work that's actually become popular again recently. I think there's a Netflix version of that did really well. Most people are aware of of course, this was supposedly a true story with the Amityville Horror again, which was the house, whatever evil dwelled there in the house. And Poe uses that here. But I think what's really important in this particular story is the way that he uses the different meanings of the term house. I mean, obviously the physical house itself, which has a fissure or a crack that runs down the face of it, that's immediately noticed by our narrator as he first comes riding onto the scene. But the house is quickly used as the other meaning of house, of course, is family, the family of Usher. And there we quickly realize there is a fault, a hereditary fault in the House of Usher, just as there is a crack in that house. And then throughout the course of the story, Roderick's own mind, even to the point of it being his head, takes the form of the house, because there's the poem that's a part of the story called The Haunted Palace, composed by Roderick, that has two windows, that has a door of pearl and ruby. It has golden banners flying over the top, and you realize this is a human face that you're seeing. And the poem relates how in the beginning, what you would see through those two windows was all very well ordered and in tune as people danced together in there. But that evil things in robes of sorrow assailed the monarch's high estate and took over, so that now travelers within the valley look in through those windows and everything is discordant and out of tune. And now there are vast forms that move fantastically within that house. And what comes out of the doorway, where it used to be echoes that sang the wit and wisdom of the king, of the thought who was the king, now it's simply hideous laughter that comes out. So the house becomes a metaphor for his mind, as his mind is overtaken by mental illness. And I think that's the other aspect of Poe. Most of his great horror tales, we're left asking the question, has something supernatural happened here? Or are we reading about someone being overtaken by some form of mental illness, and that all of the terrible things that ensue are a result of that? And perhaps some of the things that are related to us as fact never even happen at all.
Right, right. And when we think about forms of a person, also, what we can take from this particular story is the theme of duality and what Poe coined as the bipart soul. So can you explain what Poe meant by this idea?
Yes, it's an idea that comes up frequently in his fiction. And it comes out of his belief that in his era, really in the post-Enlightenment era, that we were suffering from a kind of a split. We had that side of ourselves that was that is logical and rational. But there's that side that is spiritual and emotional and creative. And that in previous times that those sides of the self were able to more freely communicate. But because of the scientific revolution, because the scientific revolution's over reliance, imposed belief at least, on the factual, that there's been this split that has occurred between these sides of the soul or the sides of the self. And now it's much more difficult to bridge that gap. He wrote one of his best known poems is called Sonnet to Science, where he talks about science as a vulture that preys on the heart of the poet. And that's science is the culprit that has caused this split of the self. And so as that plays out in his fiction, you have dualities. You have twins in the story we're talking about here. You have a doppelganger kind of a figure in the story William Wilson, which is itself a very frightening story, which again has been retold in a lot of modern fiction. I think of Stephen King's The Dark Half, which is a kind of a William Wilson story. Another interesting manifestation of this is in Poe's detective stories. He wrote several of these. The Murders in the Rue Morgue is one of the most famous. And in that particular story, his detective figure, whose name is Auguste Dupin, is talking about, our narrator, is talking about Dupin and his ability to solve crimes. And it's because, the narrator tells us, that Dupin has this bipart soul, this split, and the two sides of his self don't really get along all that well. And in that story, in fact, the word bipart, the term bipart soul is actually used. And he goes on to say that Auguste Dupin is better able to understand the criminal mind because of his diseased intelligence.
Oh, wow.
And the reason I mentioned that too, again, just to tie into modern horror stories, all of these, the Thomas Harris stories of Hannibal Lecter and Red Dragon and all of that, you have these figures, particularly in the novel Red Dragon and the film made from it. I forget the guy's name, but anyway, the idea is he can understand the mind of the killer better because he has all of these problems himself. And there's even some suspense there as to whether he might himself become a serial killer because he has this diseased intelligence and can better understand the mind of a serial killer. Well, all of that goes all the way back to Poe's idea of the bipart soul, the split within the self.
Great. Now, when we think of Gothic literature, of course, we think of large, dark, dusty mansions, ghosts, things that go bump in the night, ultimately fear. And you can say in many ways, Gothic literature has highly influenced pop culture and our love of Halloween. So tell me, why do you think people are drawn to and intrigued by dark themes found in Gothic literature? And how do you think that has influenced everything from horror films to urban legends and other folklore?
Well, it's certainly a fascinating subject, and I agree with you completely that it has very much over the years influenced our literature, whether it's popular literature or what we would think of as the literary canon. We really find horror stories in both. And clearly that's going to go back into our legends, our myths, our folklore. And, as we look back on all of that, we can find roots of beliefs in malevolent spirits, whether we look at Hebrew literature. We don't find it so much in the Torah or what Christians would think of as the Old Testament, but in some of these pseudepigraphical books outside of the canon. And in Jewish Midrash, you find beliefs that the sons of God had relations with human women and gave birth to these beings that then became malevolent spirits, what we came over the years to call demons. Abaddon and Apollyon and Beelzebub. Beelzebub has his roots in the beliefs of the Canaanite people. So that's all in the whole Judeo-Christian side. We can find roots of belief in evil spirits. But if we look to African folklore, there is the Shaitani, again, who are evil, beings who desire the harm of humans and that take different forms. Native American tradition, there's the Wendigo, which can actually possess a human and then give the human, evil motivations and cause him to do or her to do terrible things. And there have been, in fact, movies made based on both of those traditions fairly recently. But I think in the end, it's just a part of our evolutionary DNA, and it goes all the way back, I believe. And Stephen King has written on this as well. I don't want to claim it as my own ideas, not that it's that profound, but just the whole idea that as our early progenitors sat around the campfire and became aware that there was something lurking around just outside the firelight, maybe you could just catch a reflection of its red eyes, and you just weren't quite sure what that was moving around out there. Our imaginations fill in the blanks. And in fact, that's, as we work our way around to Poe, I think that's really where he was such a master in understanding that it's really the imagination that creates these horrors. I've always felt that the best horror cinema is, are those where we don't quite see what it is we fear. And the director leaves it open to us to form those pictures. Something like the Blair Witch Project or something like that, where you're not really sure what's outside of the camera's lens there, or, and you have to visualize it for yourself. And to me, those are much more chilling than all these CGI renderings of, werewolves that we can actually see them transform, et cetera, et cetera. It's our imaginations in the end that can really frighten us. And I think that's what Poe understood very well.
Yeah, you really brought up a lot. I mean, just thinking about, as you said, going back to some of the old religious and cultural traditions, moving all the way up to modern times, it's like these stories kind of even help us try to make sense of the world that we don't understand. There's so much. The earth is so vast. Space is vast. And so trying to make sense of your place in all of it, I can see how, as you're running through your imagination, these type of figures and characters and stories will come to be. And I think what's even more deep about this particular story, in addition to that, are these other things that you talked about a little bit earlier. So you have that bipart soul, of course, that shows up in this particular story, but then there's also isolation, and then illness, which you talked about a little bit earlier, death, being buried alive, and inability to escape. Touch on some of those other things.
Well, let's focus especially on the whole premature burial and being buried alive. We do see that so often in Poe. And as I said, we could probably look back to his interest in that historical Usher house story that we talked about earlier. But it also is very much tied into this idea of the bipart soul, because what we see over and over in Poe's fiction and even in his poetry, one side tends to overtake the other. The dark side, rises up somehow against the light side. What we see in The Fall of the House of Usher, of course, is that Madeline Usher is buried alive by her brother. She is entombed while she's still alive. There's some question as to whether he actually knows it when he does it.
Right.
I mean, if we look back, we see that even before her death, he is painting pictures of tombs and things like that. So certainly the idea of entombment is in his mind. Mm-hmm. But what we know beyond a shadow of a doubt is that very soon after placing her in the tomb, he hears her and knows that she's still alive, and yet doesn't want to let her out. And so in these stories of premature burial, what we usually see is that cold, rational side, perhaps, of the self has tried to push that other side under the rug, to pretend it's not there. That dark side of the self, well, we just won't think about that. We will repress it. And of course, we become aware really of how this sort of is a precursor of more modern psychological ideas, because when you repress that side of the self, well, eventually the pressure builds and it builds and it builds until it comes out. And when it comes out, it's violent sometimes, which is, of course, what happens in our story. He tries to entomb her, and yet she, that great heavy door, she's able to open it and to come for him in that horrific moment at the end of the story. Well, that's the other side of the self that has been shoved into a dark closet and locked away. Well, you can't keep that side, the unconscious. We can't lock it away. It will, if we try to repress it, it'll come for us eventually. And Poe really seems to have understood that, even though he's writing years before the psychologists who would later, have similar theories.
That's so true. That is so true. And as much as we, talk about Frederick, the main character in this particular play, or in this particular story, in this version of the tale, there's also the friend named Jonathan. And I can kind of see a reader, or in this case, the listener, siding or feeling relatable to Jonathan. And what I find interesting about Poe's story is his choice to have the friend almost become engrossed in the same fear that Roderick experiences. The friend begins to hear the shrieks and the sounds in the house too. And in some ways, it seems that Poe was trying to draw the reader into being just as frightened as Jonathan is. Would you say Poe did this to challenge the character's rationality as well?
Oh, I definitely think so. I think what you're seeing there, it's another characteristic of Poe. It's what we call phantasmagoria, and this is a term that Poe uses himself a number of times in his fiction. He uses it in The Fall of the House of Usher when he talks about that painting. He calls it a phantasmagoric conception. But phantasmagoria, basically, it's the idea that we can't be sure that we are seeing what we think we see. A shifting series of illusions and deceptive appearances, to the point where our mind does start to fill in the blanks. And the way I always describe this to my students, I say, imagine you go to see a scary movie with your friends on Friday night, and then you come back and you go to bed, and you hang up your clothes and you get in bed and you're trying to go to sleep, and that you're afraid, and all of a sudden you think you see a man standing at the foot of your bed, and you're just horrified. You turn on the light and you see that it's just where you hung up your coat.
Yes.
Your mind plugs in all of your fears, and you come to believe that is a man standing there. And I think that's what happens in his phantasmagoric stories. Over and over, we see narrators that say, could I really be seeing this? Could I really have heard that? And of course, especially at the end of Usher, you hear this as they are reading the poem, the Mad Tryst of Sir Launcelot Canning. And he's trying to calm Roderick down by reading him his favorite story. And yet all of the sounds they're starting to hear in the house seem to parallel the very thing that you're reading about in the poem. And you get all those question marks. I always point my students to the question marks. Look, could this be happening? Could it be occurring? Did I really hear that? that's phantasmagoria, and it builds that suspense. It builds the effect, the horrific effect at the end where we really did hear her, and there she is outside the door. All the way up to that moment, our narrator doesn't really believe that could be possible,
Right.
and all of a sudden, there she is, and that's it's horrifying.
Right. And he dashes out before everything just falls in on itself. And
Yes,
essentially the fall of the House of Usher.
absolutely.
And so Edgar Allan Poe is considered a central figure of Romanticism and Gothic horror literature. This period in literature, it included other great writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne. We think of Washington Irving and Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, um, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, all of these great works. Can you speak about these two literary movements, Romanticism and Gothic horror literature, and what was happening at the time that allowed these movements to thrive and create a new generation of writers?
Well, you've already kind of nailed it in the sense that you've identified them all as a part of the Romantic movement, which really begins. We typically say that it begins in 1798 because that's when Wordsworth and Coleridge's work was written, the lyrical ballads, and they define Romanticism in the preface to the lyrical ballads. I'm sorry to have gone down that rabbit trail, but the point is that's why we typically say that right there at about the beginning of the 19th century is the beginning of the Romantic movement. And I always tell my students that these literary and philosophical movements tend to be like a tug of war.
Mm-hmm.
And in the century up until the 19th century, it had been all about reason, the age of reason, the Enlightenment. The human intellect can understand everything. We can, there are scientific laws that rule everything that we perceive, and it can, whether we understand it yet or not, it's all within our capability to eventually explain and understand with our intellect. That's the age of reason. Well, the Romantics then tug against that, react against that, and say you're missing something entirely. You're missing that imaginative side of who we are.
Right.
The dark side, again, the creative side, the spiritual side, the artistic side, all this, that there is that aspect to human existence. And obviously we're back to the bipart soul here again.
Mm-hmm.
But these writers, like Poe, Hawthorne was one, as you mentioned, and Mary Shelley, Washington Irving, The Headless Horseman, Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Again, they were celebrating that side of the self that was drawn to the unexplained after having a whole century of we can explain it all. And the Romantics say, no, there are things that will never be able to be explained with just our human reason.
Wow. Well, you, of course, have given us a lot to think about today, especially with the mind, imagination, and of course, great literature. So thank you, Dr. Vaughan, for sharing your insight into Edgar Allan Poe and the story, The Fall of the House of Usher. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun.
This podcast was produced by the Office of Marketing and Communications at Clayton State University. Special thanks to Chantel Thrash, director of the theater program, for casting the actors for this production. This retelling stars Denzell Walker as Roderick Usher and the Groom, Jay Kraft as Jonathan Beringer, Jazmine Carmichael as Madeline Usher and Mrs. Finley, Nancy Nguyen as Dr. Cordwell, and Carol Welter as the narrator. Ja'Cory Neal served as director of the production. If you enjoyed what you heard today, spread the word. Help us reach more listeners by downloading episodes of the Laker Lounge from Podbean, following Clayton State on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, or by visiting www.clayton.edu. This episode of Laker Lounge was produced by Brandon McCowan and Kelly Petty. Until next time, happy Halloween.